the Central European Affairs podcast, and the host today is Zoltán Kész, and my guest today is Roland Freudenstein, who is the policy director of the Martens Center. Mr. Freudenstein, it's very good to have you here on our show, and I heard that you are stuck in Brussels. How are you working from home in this pandemic?
Well, first of all, a cordial good morning to Hungary. From Brussels, indeed. Well, you know, stuck is maybe not the totally correct word, because I mean, this is my home. So yes, I am confined to my home, and we telework here with my wife and my family. We telework from our home in Brussels, and you know, one gets used to it. It's a little bit cumbersome. It's a little bit tiring, but we're all looking forward to the time when the whole of Europe is vaccinated, maybe by the end of this year, and then we can return to some degree of normality.
Well, exactly. Now, since you're working for a very important foundation, my first question is how you see the role and future European political foundations in the short term and in the midterm. Are they going to be influential? Are they going to disappear?
Well, yeah.
What's your idea?
Two things. There are pluses and minuses to this situation. On the plus side, I would say in any time of crisis and big change, places where people think are becoming more important. So, you know, a time of upheaval, and that's what we're going through indeed, like this pandemic and its economic and technological and social consequences, think tanks are even more important than during normal times, because think tanks try to make sense of what is happening, you know. So a foundation like the Martens Center, which is the think tank of the European People's Party, in other words, the center-right political family in the European Union, you know, such think tanks are really, really even more important. That's the positive side. The negative side is, very simply, we all know that for years to come, we will suffer the economic consequences of the pandemic. And that will sooner or later also rub off on the financing of, well, not only public services and universities and schools and so on, but also think tanks. So since we are almost 100% financed by the European Parliament, which is a public institution, so taxpayer financed, I think we might also suffer consequences one day. But and what is true for us is all the more true for think tanks which depend on private financing, private donations. And they're already feeling the heat. I mean, I talk to colleagues in other institutions, other think tanks, and they're telling me precisely this. Private donors, private sponsors are breaking away as we speak, and that's quite a dramatic development. So you know, on the one hand, our role is becoming more important. On the other hand, the financial basis for think tank work is probably going to dwindle in the near future.
Okay, you mentioned that it's very important for think tanks to appear in the solution of the pandemic, you know, economic solution, vaccination solution, and so on and so forth. But we see also, for example, in Hungary, that individual countries are handling the situation totally separately from the European Union, or even blaming the European Union for slowing down the vaccination process. How do you see that?
It's very simple. If there were no European Union today, we would have vaccination wars between the countries of Europe of a dimension we can't even imagine right now. So small countries would have no chance negotiating favorable conditions and deals and deliveries with big pharma companies if they were left on their own and if they had to compete openly with big member states. So that's a big advantage of the European Union. Yes, the EU has been slower to certify vaccines than countries like Israel, the US, or the UK. And also, the European Union has probably not used the best negotiating skills vis-a-vis some of the companies like AstraZeneca, for example. That's a big scandal in Brussels. So the performance of the European Union was suboptimal in the beginning of this vaccination process. But it was way better to have the European Union than not to have it, because that would have meant that small and not so affluent countries would have completely been thrown under the bus. And I mean, there probably wouldn't even have been enough Russian and Chinese vaccines to satisfy the demand of all the small countries in Europe. So that was no alternative to the deal negotiated by the European institutions either.
However, you mentioned the Russian and the Chinese vaccine, and we see it in Hungary now that the Hungarian government is actually reaching out to these two countries and to their vaccines. Just we've heard that we have 500,000 Chinese vaccines arriving in the country, arriving in the European Union, that is. Still, no European agency has approved these vaccines. What do you think of that?
Well, it's a gamble, very simply. You know, these are governments that deliberately renounce on the safety standards in the European Union for vaccines, medical safety standards that are there to protect people and citizens, and they're doing this just in order to get faster a big number of vaccines. So, you know, no one can prevent these governments from doing so. This is within their remit as national governments. But we have to call a spade and say that these governments are gambling with the health of their citizens.
Well, it's very good that you mentioned these governments are gambling. Is Fidesz also gambling in the EPP, or has it been gambling in the EPP?
Well, you know, people say that Viktor Orban is a gambler by nature, and he likes to attack and he likes to win. And according to the Fidesz media, he is winning at least for the last 10 years without any interruption. Well, if that were so, I don't think that the presence of Fidesz in the EPP political family would be so disputed. So there has to be some a grain of fake news in this myth that he's always winning. But anyway, yes, of course, you know, Fidesz is for the moment trying to remain in the EPP, although it is suspended, and in the party itself, it cannot participate in any meetings, any official organs of the EPP. It does not take part in the process of defining the future of the political family and the future program of the European Union as seen by the EPP. It can't send delegates to congresses or to the political assembly of the European People's Party. So in all these ways, Fidesz is suspended. Now, we all know that Fidesz is trying to portray this as a mutual suspension, but we also all know that that was not true, that this suspension happened very much against the will of Viktor Orban, who for once was not winning at that moment.
Well, yeah, that's definitely true. And how long do you think this can last? This suspension has been in effect for quite a while now.
2 years, almost 2 years now. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think it can go on forever because frankly speaking, there will not be a majority to reestablish full membership rights for Fidesz unless Fidesz fundamentally changes its course.
Do you think it will happen?
No.
No, you're pessimistic about it. So this suspension will remain. And does that mean that there's a way for Fidesz to be out of the EPP and be in another party family?
Well, we all know that this has been thoroughly examined and analyzed by the spin doctors, of which there are many, around Viktor Orbán and the Fidesz party. So, you know, as usual, the more advice you get, the more contradictory the advice becomes. And certainly joining another political family is on the minds of the leaders of Fidesz. We saw the trip by Foreign Minister Szijjártó to 4 national populist or sovereignist leaders a couple of months ago, ostensibly for discussing migration questions, but we all know that this had a party political component of, you know, demonstrating that Fidesz also has alternatives to the EPP family. That was just one tiny example. You know, it is obviously it is clear that Fidesz is thinking of alternatives. But on the other hand, I think to any observer who looks a little bit closer at the situation, it is clear that there are no easy alternatives. You know, in the European Parliament, you have 2 groups, 2 parliamentary caucuses on the right of the EPP. And that is, one is the Identity and Democracy group, which is highly heterogeneous, very disorganized. It contains people like Matteo Salvini from Italy, for example. And you know, that is, I think it would be difficult for Fidesz to join such a disorganized group that doesn't have a coherent ideological concept. And then you have the slightly better structured and better organized European conservatives and reformists, the ECR group, and that is led basically by the Polish Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, the Peace Party of Jarosław Kaczyński, and also to a lesser degree by the Italian Fratelli dell'Italia, it's Giorgia Meloni. So, you know, the problem is that Fidesz is friendly with some of these people and less friendly with others. It would definitely be impossible to create one big right-wing anti-migration movement in the European Parliament and the European Union. I think that was the plan of some people in Fidesz before the last European elections, but it was already clear right after the elections that this would not come about. There would not be one big right-wing movement. So, you know, for the moment, remaining with one foot in the mainstream and at the same time flirting with right-wing alternatives is the best bet that Fidesz seems to have.
Okay, well, you mentioned that there is no alternative for Fidesz at the moment, but as far as I can see, there's no alternative from Hungary in the EPP, so no alternative party from Hungary in the EPP. So as far as we can see it in Hungary, it's very comfortable for EPP to have Fidesz because it has many votes this way. And isn't there some kind of a reaching out to other right-wing or center-right parties in Hungary that the EPP is doing?
Well, not as far as I know for the moment. You know, and I think what is more relevant here, if you talk about having Hungarian votes, what is more relevant is the EPP group in the European Parliament. And there we have a very interesting process, which we're going to discuss in a minute now, I guess. But as far as alternatives in Hungary to Fidesz, are concerned, there are no concrete plans to reach out to anyone, or at least not that I know of.
That's very interesting, because just a couple of days ago I had a podcast in which it was mentioned that Fidesz is shifting to the far right. However, Jobbik is going to the center right. Do you see it this way, or are you skeptical about this?
I know that leaders of Jobbik have suggested this for some time already. I hear this like now for a whole year at least. And this is connected to some speculations that Jobbik might join the EPP. Now, seriously, from the EPP side, I don't see any sign for this happening. So you know, there is the situation is frozen, very simply.
I see. Now, another question. You're one of the leaders of the Martin Center, and you've probably heard that the party foundation of Fidesz has bought a very, very expensive real estate in Schumann Square in Brussels from Hungarian taxpayers' money.
Yeah, 102 square meters.
Exactly, because in Hungary it created kind of like a scandal, but I don't know how you see it as a think tanker. And you talked about taxpayers' money at the beginning of this podcast. So what's your opinion?
Well, in principle, there's nothing wrong with taxpayers' money being spent on think tanks if they're accountable, if their values and their actions correspond to the fundamental values of liberal democracy. There is no problem with this. And I wouldn't say that the very fact that that PMA, Civic Hungary, is spending this money is anything to comment on. So it depends on what they do with this money according to Hungarian laws.
Yeah, which is very legal, definitely, because there is no problem with legality, and there has been no problem with legality at all, according to Hungarian laws. One other thing, a couple of weeks ago, we talked with Leszek Balcerowicz about the possibilities of Poland and Hungary finding their ways outside the European Union. Do you think that in the future there will be a Huxit or a Polexit for these countries?
Well, you know, I just recently read an interview with Viktor Orbán himself just a few weeks ago, in which he said that, look, Brexit took place in completely different circumstances, because Britain is surrounded by an ocean. Hungary is surrounded by land neighbors, and therefore Hungary would be completely stupid to leave the European Union. So I take Viktor Orbán's word for that.
All right. Well, I understand you. However, we can see signs now that, especially in the communication of the party, of the governing party, that are praising Britain for leaving the European Union, especially now with the vaccination problems of the European Union, saying that, oh, 20% of the British people have been vaccinated. So there is a space outside the European Union.
Again, this is not quite as I understood Viktor Orbán. I mean, he says Brexit should never have happened, but of course he puts the blame on people in Brussels, especially people like Jean-Claude Juncker, and he blames them for Brexit, which I think is a gross misunderstanding of the forces inside Great Britain that were working on Brexit for decades already. You know, we have to do with different perceptions of reality, but I don't think that Viktor Orbán or Fidesz applauds Brexit. They have a certain understanding for the reasons why Britain wanted to leave this European Union. That is true. But and of course, as we all know, the Brexiteers in Britain itself are being hugely encouraged by the success of a fast accreditation and a fast vaccination process. And this has a certain influence on the way other nations look at Brexit. But I still maintain that if you look at all the opinion polls since the referendum on Brexit in 2016, you know, the image of the European Union has vastly increased during that time, because people saw the political and economic and administrative chaos that is connected to such an exit from the European Union. And in virtually all member states, the willingness to leave the European Union has decreased in that time. And I don't think the vaccination crisis is enough to turn this development around and make exiting from the European Union any easier.
Well, I understand you. A final question: what are the challenges of the Martin Center, of the EPP, and the European Union for the near future, besides the pandemic?
Well, I would say the big challenge of the upcoming decade is saving democracy. You know, that's the #1 challenge for the European Union, and this has a global aspect because you know, in the entire world we have authoritarianism now competing with, actually in some cases fighting with, liberal democracy. And the same is true inside the European Union and inside most member states, because we have authoritarian governments in the European Union, and we have a sovereignist, nativist, authoritarian parties that would like to transform their countries into autocracies if they came to power. And these two effects, the authoritarian international, if you want, and the populist, nativist, sovereignist parties inside the European Union reinforce each other, which to me can only mean one thing: that the democrats of this world have to get together and have to defend democracy inside their own countries, and constitutionality and the rule of law and checks and balances. But they also have to increase global support for democrats in all countries. You know, from Venezuela to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, to Moscow, to Minsk, to other places where people are taking formidable risks, personal risks, to fight for the rule of law, checks and balances, the freedom of opinion, in one word, liberal democracy. So this is one struggle, you know, and that's the biggest challenge for the European Union in the 10 years ahead. Everything else comes after this, and there's a lot that comes after this, of course. But we can talk about this if you want.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I understand, and I agree that we have to be very vigilant about liberal democracy, not only outside the European Union, but inside the European Union. Well,
you know, if I may, well, just one more word. Liberal democracy is not liberalism. You know, these are two different things, and this is something that Fidesz constantly and deliberately conflagrates. Liberalism as a political philosophy and liberal policies are confined to one part of the political spectrum in a democracy. But liberal democracy is the constitutional guarantee of checks and balances, of independent institutions, free press, a pluralistic press, a vibrant civil society, independent courts, independent institutions, all this. So, you know, I mean, this is something that in the Hungarian debate is very often just swept under the carpet, as if liberal democracy were an electoral system in which liberals always have to win. That's the way Zoltán Spox puts it, right? And that is just not true. This is a deliberate reversal of truth, the way he puts it. Liberal democracy is independent institutions, and there is nothing, no aspect of George Soros financing this idea. There is nothing pro-migratory in liberal democracy, by the way. You know, all these claims need to be refuted, and I wish that my political family, the EPP, was more determined in rejecting these totally false representations of reality. So sorry for the
well,
interruption.
thank you. That was a very good final statement, I think, and I really want to thank you, Mr. Freudenstein, for participating on our Central European Affairs podcast. And I really wish that the challenges ahead of you and the European Union and the whole world would be solved in the near future. Thank you very much for participating.
Well, thanks for having me.